what sensory receptor is going to sense most of this? Chemoreceptors, because most of this is chemical changes in the blood. So chemoreceptors are going to sense these chemical changes. And they will trigger vasodilation in the local arterioles. That will increase blood flow to that area. So if you are riding a bike, you're pedaling against resistance, you want to increase blood flow to those muscles that are working. You want to decrease blood flow everywhere else. So that's exactly what happens. You start pedaling on the bike, your body secretes epinephrine. Now you have epinephrine in your blood going around everywhere. As it goes through your biceps, it's going to cause vasoconstriction. As it goes through your digestive tract, it's going to cause vasoconstriction. As it goes to your skin, it's going to cause vasodilation. That's going to help you thermoregulate. As it gets to your quadriceps, it's going to try to cause vasoconstriction, but in your quadriceps, because those muscles are working, you have those conditions. So those vessels are going to vasodilate. Even though epinephrine is trying to cause vasoconstriction, we're going to get vasodilation because of the chemoreceptors. So this is how we control our blood flow during exercise and get it to where it's needed. So we're going to shut down everywhere except the exercising muscle and the skin, with a combination of extrinsic and intrinsic control. Does that make sense to you?
Say that one more time.
Okay. The whole thing?
Yes.
Okay, so you're sitting on a bike, you're pedaling against resistance. That's going to trigger your adrenal glands to secrete epinephrine. Now, the epinephrine is just in your blood, and it's going around your body. Everywhere it goes, epinephrine causes vasoconstriction. Okay, for riding a bike, we don't need a lot of blood going to our biceps. We don't need a lot of blood going to our digestive tract. We don't need a lot of blood going to our brain. So it's going to cause vasoconstriction everywhere, except at the vessels near the skin that responds differently. We're going to get vasodilation there, increased blood flow to the skin. That's why some people's faces will turn red when they're exercising. It's just increased blood flow to the skin. So vasodilation at the skin. When it gets to the exercising muscle, in this case it's the quadriceps, it's going to be overpowered by what the chemoreceptors are trying to do, so that we can get vasodilation specifically in the exercising muscle because of the conditions it's created. So you can think of it as kind of a battle between the intrinsic control and the extrinsic control in the exercising muscle. Epinephrine's trying to cause vasoconstriction. Chemoreceptors are trying to cause vasodilation. Which one's going to win? The chemoreceptors have to win. If epinephrine wins, we wouldn't be able to increase blood flow to our exercising muscles. We wouldn't be able to exercise. So we have to be able to get vasodilation at the exercising muscle and vasoconstriction everywhere else. Okay, so another term you need here. Sympatholysis. Sympatholysis is the ability of the vessels to dilate at the exercising muscle, even in the presence of epinephrine, which is trying to cause vasoconstriction. Sympatholysis is the ability to have vasodilation at the exercising muscle, even in the presence of epinephrine, which is trying to cause vasoconstriction. Do you need me to say that again?
Yes.
Sympatholysis is the ability to have vasodilation at the exercising muscle, even in the presence of epinephrine, which is trying to cause vasoconstriction. So, intrinsic control of blood flow, the vessels controlling themselves, that occurs at the exercising muscle in these conditions, causing vasodilation. Extrinsic control of blood flow is epinephrine acting on the arterioles. It's something external acting on it. Don't confuse intrinsic control of blood flow with intrinsic control of heart rate. We have intrinsic and extrinsic control of blood flow. an intrinsic and extrinsic control of heart rate. So if I ask you to describe intrinsic control of blood flow, don't start talking about the SA node. Okay, blood flow is controlled by arterioles. So if I ask you about intrinsic and extrinsic control of blood flow, you gotta talk about arterioles. Heart rate is controlled by the SA node. So if I ask you about intrinsic and extrinsic control of heart rate, you gotta talk about the SA node. Questions on any of that? Okay.
Extrinsic control of arterioles is just epinephrine, right?
Epinephrine. Okay. Next. I think it's cardiovascular drift. We haven't done cardiovascular drift yet, right? Okay, so I'm gonna give you a scenario. Let's say you are training to run a marathon, and so you've been running every day, and you run consistently 45 minutes to an hour every day. Just go with me on this, okay? It is the middle of August in beautiful Northridge, California. You go to a party, and you eat an entire pizza and drink an entire case of beer, and then you go to sleep. And so you of course sleep all morning. You wake up in the middle of the day, and you are determined to not skip your run. You're gonna go do your run anyway, even though you feel disgusting after the night before. So you go to the gym. It's the middle of the day in August in Northridge, so it's 110 degrees out. You go to the gym, and because it's 24-hour fitness, the AC is broken. And the windows are all closed, they have no fans on, and you forgot your water. But you're gonna get on the treadmill anyway. Okay? So you get on the treadmill, and you start doing your run, and you normally can run for an hour, no problem, at let's say 7 miles per hour, just a steady state pace. Okay? So you get on the treadmill and you do your run. If you're keeping a steady state pace, what should your heart rate be doing during that run? It should stay steady. In the graphs we've drawn where the heart rate is increasing, that's because your intensity is increasing. And every time we bump up the intensity, the heart rate goes up. We bump up the intensity, the heart rate goes up. But if you're staying at the same intensity, your heart rate should stay steady. Okay? So you're running at your comfortable pace, whatever it is, 7 miles per hour, whatever it is. Your heart rate is at a steady, let's say 160. Half hour into your run, your heart rate starts to climb. 165, 170, 175, 180. This is not normal. This is your heart rate increasing without an increase in intensity. If the intensity bumped up, it would be normal for the heart rate to go up, but the intensity stayed the same and the heart rate jumped up. This is cardiovascular drift, so your heart rate is drifting upward when it shouldn't. So cardiovascular drift is an increase in heart rate without an increase in intensity. Cardiovascular drift is an increase in heart rate without an increase in intensity. It's not normal. It's a problem. So I created a very specific scenario for you. What's the primary thing going on here? You're dehydrated, you're hot, right? It's 110 degrees. There's no AC on, there's no windows open, there's no fan, and you don't have water. So you're going to be sweating a lot, okay? So we already said the mechanism behind that sweat is the epinephrine causing vasodilation in the vessels near the skin. This is going to allow you to sweat. And in these conditions, you're going to sweat a lot. Okay? That sweat is coming from your blood plasma. So if you're sweating a lot, your blood plasma levels are going to drop. If your blood plasma levels drop, your total blood volume is going to drop. So you have less total blood in your body because you've sweat so much. If you have less blood in your body, you're going to get less blood into your heart. What's the term for the amount of blood you can fit into your left ventricle? End diastolic volume. So if you have less blood in your body, you're going to have less blood in your heart, which is a decrease in end diastolic volume. If you get less blood into your heart, you're going to get less blood out of your heart. That's stroke volume. So the problem with sweating so much is your stroke volume is going to drop. Okay? But if you're maintaining your same intensity, if it's 7 miles per hour, we could calculate what the oxygen requirement is for that, right? Everybody knows how to do that? So your delivery of oxygen with your cardiac output has to stay the same for you to maintain your intensity. What does cardiac output depend on?
Heart rate.
And stroke volume.
Okay, so if your stroke volume is dropping because you're sweating and you have to maintain your cardiac output, how do you compensate for that?
Increase heart rate.
Okay, so under these conditions, cardiovascular drift typically happens in a hot environment with prolonged exercise because you're going to be sweating excessively. Hold on, it's going to cause a decrease in stroke volume. And if you're trying to maintain your intensity and your stroke volume is dropping, your heart rate has to increase to compensate to maintain your cardiac output. Bridget, go ahead.
Is that what leads to heat stroke?
It could. Yeah, so if you see this, if you feel this happening, you're keeping your same intensity and your heart rate is climbing, and you keep going, it could lead to heat exhaustion, which could lead to heat stroke if you don't stop. Yeah, it's a red flag that something's wrong. Go ahead.
So what does eating all that food cause? The whole pizza and the quesadilla.
Sleeping.
It's a lot of self-poor nutrition.
It just makes you just feel.
Why did I include that in the story?
Because they're hungover and won't eat
Not right.
Sure, why I included that.
Details.
I think you're just giving details as to their hungover.
It's really not related. I was just showing how determined you were, even in those conditions, to not skip your run. I suppose I can leave that part of the story.
So if you're perfectly if you're dehydrated, then that wouldn't be a cause heat stroke or anything. But if you're hydrated and that happens, then something's wrong still.
So yeah, the way you stop this from happening or minimizing this is by not allowing yourself to get dehydrated. So don't forget your water. I mean, if you notice those conditions, and it's 110 degrees out in the middle of the day, there's no AC, no windows, no air, and you have your water, I would skip your run.
Yeah.
Or go get some water. Yeah, but if you stay hydrated, then this won't happen. But the alcohol will dehydrate you also. Alcohol's a diuretic.
What about pizza?
Pizza's fine.
Is there a way to increase stroke volume, just like from everyday activities?
Yeah, stroke volume will increase with training. And we'll talk about when we get to the training chapter.
Does that differ from blood doping?
We're gonna get into blood doping in a minute. Yeah. Okay, any questions on cardiovascular drift? Go ahead.
So even if you're hydrated, is there still a way for that to happen?
So no, this is
That's
from
only
dehydration. So
Okay.
this shouldn't happen if you're well hydrated.
Okay.
But that's why this typically happens in a hot environment with prolonged exercise when someone would tend to get dehydrated. Okay, last topic in this chapter, I believe, is the components of blood. So if we were to take out some of your blood and put it in a centrifuge and spin it, it would separate into solid and liquid. I'm very upset I don't have a red pen for my blood drawer.
I have a red. Somewhere.
Seal it.
Somehow drawing blood in blue just doesn't work for me. Thank you.
Free oxygen.
She said she didn't want blue.
I have blue. Okay, so solid and liquid. The solid part we call formed elements. Formed elements is mostly your red blood cells. Red blood cells are what have the hemoglobin that carries oxygen in your blood. Formed elements also has white blood cells and platelets, but we're mostly concerned with red blood cells because they help us exercise. The liquid part is plasma, which is mostly water. So your total blood volume is separated into two parts, plasma and formed elements. The higher the percentage of your total blood volume that's formed elements, the thicker your blood will be. Right? If you think about how much chocolate syrup you're putting into your chocolate milk, the more chocolate syrup you put in, the darker it's going to get, the thicker it's going to be,
The better it is.
the better it is. Okay? So the higher your percentage of formed elements, the thicker the blood will be. So the term for that is hematocrit. Hematocrit tells you basically what percent of your blood is formed elements. It's going to give you information about how thick the blood is. So, if it's telling us what percentage of our blood is formed elements, what would be the formula for this?
Formed elements over TVV times 1.
Formed elements divided by total blood volume is going to give you what percentage of the blood is formed elements. It'll be times 100 because it's considered a percent. So normal hematocrit is 45, which means 45% of the blood is formed elements. For some reason they don't put a percent on hematocrit, they just leave it as 45, but that's what it means.
It's a weird thing.
So if hematocrit gets higher, hematocrit and viscosity are basically the same thing, right? If hematocrit goes up, your blood is going to be thicker. Thickness of the blood is viscosity. So if hematocrit goes up, viscosity goes up. If viscosity goes up, resistance goes up. If resistance goes up, blood pressure goes up. So all those things are connected. So as the ratio of formed elements to plasma changes, it changes the hematocrit and affects all those other things. So can we change the amount of plasma we have?
Yes.
How?
Water.
Typically through hydration. So if you get dehydrated, like we just talked about, plasma level drops. Not only is our total blood volume lower, but our blood is much thicker. Hematocrit is going to be higher. Okay, so it's important to stay well hydrated. Can we change the number of red blood cells we have?
Yes.
We can. How?
Bone marrow transplant.
Okay, that would be extreme.
Damn.
Mind waves.
Is that blood doping?
It's kind of blood doping. Let me get to blood doping in a second. So this is what altitude does for you. If you're in altitude, so it's harder for you to get oxygen into your blood, which I'll be able to talk more about when we get to the respiration chapter. It's harder to get oxygen into your blood at altitude. So your body responds to that by producing more red blood cells. So if somebody who has more red blood cells living at an altitude, when they come down to sea level to compete, they have a massive advantage because they have more red blood cells than anybody else. Red blood cells have hemoglobin that carry oxygen. So if you're doing an aerobic endurance event, it's a massive benefit. So a lot of people try to do training at altitude to get that benefit. The problem is the intensity that you can train at sea level or whatever your normal altitude is. If you go and try to train at that same level at altitude, you won't be able to because it's harder to get the oxygen into your blood. So your normal workout is going to feel much harder at altitude, so you're not going to be able to train at the same intensity, which is not going to be beneficial. What's beneficial is living at altitude so you get this adaptation and then training at sea level. So living high, training low is actually now the model for that rather than living low and going and training high. Gabby, go ahead.
So is that why a lot of people, they use that mask?
That mask, yes, is mimicking altitude training,
But like
which
you
will
said,
trigger your body to produce more red blood cells.
but it won't be any beneficial if they are breaking that.
So the increase in red blood cells can be beneficial, but the training itself will be at a lower intensity than they're used to. So you just have to compensate for that. Go ahead.
Why is it not better to be living at higher elevation and be training at higher elevation? And then like when you're doing like terms, let's say for like sprints or endurance running, you go back to sea level. Wouldn't that just be better because your body has to get used to the
Yeah, but you can work at a higher intensity at sea level than you can at altitude.
So then you get fatigued faster at higher elevation. Then.
It's harder to get oxygen into your blood because the pressure is lower, which will make more sense in the next chapter. Okay, let's talk about blood doping. So, blood doping is when you take out some of your blood and you put it in the freezer so the red blood cells stay alive. Your body will replace it, no problem. Your body's always making new red blood cells. Right before your endurance event, like I don't know, maybe the Tour de France, you inject your blood back in. So you have way more red blood cells than everybody else, which is a huge advantage if you're doing an aerobic endurance event. And it's basically undetectable because it's your own blood. But it is illegal in sports. And it is highly effective if you have massive amounts of red blood cells. So I think what they do now, because it's been so prevalent to detect it, is for people who are at that elite level, they do regular testing of their red blood cell count so they know what their normal level is. And then if they have a big spike right before an event, then they've obviously been doping. But other than that, it's not really detectable. Go ahead.
Is blood doping so like effective in other activities other than endurance or just?
No, because it's just giving you red blood cells. So it's going to help you with endurance performance. But it's important to note that blood doping will not help an untrained person. You can't take an untrained person and do blood doping and have them win the Tour de France. It doesn't work. Because you have to have, just having the red blood cells by itself is not enough. You have to have the infrastructure, the capillaries to deliver it, the myoglobin, the mitochondria, all the oxidative enzymes, all those things that work together to help you consume oxygen, right? Just having the red blood cells by themselves doesn't help. So it has to be someone who's done all the training to have that infrastructure set up to process the oxygen. Go ahead.
Would there be any like side effects if you like, let's say, took out too much blood and then injected it back in a few days later?
What do you think?
I mean, taking out too much blood, I suppose could be a problem. It would just lay you up in bed for a few days until you replenish it. Unless you take out so much that you need a transfusion, but if that happens, you're dealing with somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. That's a little scary. Go ahead.
Is there a max blood volume to be transported?
I'm not sure what the amount of blood is. I would assume it would be about a pint that they're removing and adding back in, but I don't know the exact numbers on that. I mean, a person normally has 3 or 4 liters of blood in their body,
Mm-hmm.
so taking out a pint is fine. Go ahead.
Could you blood dope with somebody else's blood if their typing matches you?
Yes, theoretically, but that brings in other possible side effects and rejections of the blood and other things that could happen. Yeah, much safer to do it with your own.
Are there consequences to blood doping, like, if for an untrained person? So if they just tried it, but they're untrained?
It would probably help them a little bit in an
Okay.
endurance activity.
Just not
But-
as much as if you were trained?
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't
No.
All right, any questions on components of blood, hematocrit, any of that? Okay, we're gonna move on to the next chapter then. We're gonna get a little bit into the next chapter before we take a break. So the next chapter is the respiratory chapter.
This is chapter 8.
Chapter 8, yes. Okay, so we're gonna split respiration into 4 parts.
Professor?
Yep.
What about the venous return mechanism?
Oh. You said that. Alright, pause chapter 8, go back to chapter 7.
You distracted her with your blood doping question.
That's about it.
Now imagine if no one went to your other classes, we would have never
Alright,
learned.
Alright, now Sivan would have noticed that I was skipping that.
Right?
Right, Sivan?
I know. I just went over it
Talked about
too.
in the workshop, like 30 minutes ago.
He'd start talking about it tomorrow in the workshop and we'd all just be like, shit, I don't know.
Alright, so venous return, returning blood to the heart. It's important to have mechanisms in place for that because when you're exercising, your heart is pumping blood out to your body. But we don't have another heart in your feet to pump it back up. So venous return mechanisms help you bring blood back up. Most of the time we're upright, so the blood returning to the heart is against gravity. So we need extra assistance. So 3 venous return mechanisms. First one is skeletal muscle pump. So this is contracting the muscles in your legs, acts as a pump to move the blood back up. So if these are your calf muscles and you've got a vein going through your calf muscle, when you contract your calf muscle, it compresses the vein. So if you compress the vein, the blood has to move. So the veins have valves that only allow the blood to move in one direction. So once the blood passes this valve, it can't backflow and go down. So when you contract these muscles, it compresses the vein, forces the blood to move up towards the heart. So walking around assists with venous return. This is one of the reasons why you're trained to not let people sit down after they cross the finish line, right? Hold on 1 second, Jonathan. So if somebody sprints across the finish line and then they sit down, all 30 of you are gonna run over them and say, no, you can't sit down, you have to walk around just because we're trained to do that, right? This is why. Because your heart is still pumping after you run across the finish line. If you sit down, there's nothing happening in your legs to pump it back up. So if you've ever tried to do that, sprint across the finish line and then sit down, you start seeing spots. And that means you're gonna pass out because you're not getting enough blood back up into your brain. So passing out is your body's way of solving the problem because then you're lying down and you don't have to fight against gravity to get the blood back to your brain. So you could lay down. So yeah, so hold on 1 second guys. Walking around while your heart is pumping acts as a pump in your leg muscles to pump the blood back up. If the person is too tired after sprinting across the finish line to walk around, then the other option is to lie down. Even with their feet up is even better because that's going to increase blood flow to the heart and to the head. What you can't do is you can't sit down and you can't stand still because blood will pool in your legs and you'll pass out. Question, go ahead.
Is this the same sort of situation when you stand up too fast and you start to see kind of spots and you're lightheaded?
Yeah, so standing up too fast will give you a drop in blood pressure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
She had my question.
Okay. Jonathan, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I don't know if it's entirely related to this now I think about it, but it made me think about like blood flow restriction training. So like when they put those like bands around their legs or their arms, is there any actual reason why people do that?
Yes, it forces the muscle to work anaerobically, which has shown good results in training. There's a lot of research on that, on the blood flow restriction training.
I never really heard of that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Okay, second venous return mechanism is the respiratory pump. Which is basically the same idea as a skeletal muscle pump, compressing the veins and forcing the blood to move, but this is happening in your torso as you breathe. So, this is your torso. Your torso is split in half by your diaphragm, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. So, when you breathe, the diaphragm moves up and down. So when it moves down, it compresses, so you have your thoracic cavity up here where your lungs are and your abdominal cavity down here where your stomach is. So when the diaphragm presses down, it compresses your abdominal cavity, which compresses the veins in your abdominal cavity, so the blood has to move. Because of the valves, it can only move in one direction, so it's gonna move up into your thoracic cavity. Then when the diaphragm moves up, it compresses your thoracic cavity, compressing the veins, so the blood has to move. The only place it can move to is into your heart. So as you breathe, the diaphragm goes down and up, presses your abdominal cavity, presses the thoracic cavity, presses the abdominal cavity, compresses the thoracic cavity. So you're basically milking your veins, forcing the blood to return to the heart. So your elevated breathing rate during exercise is assisting with venous return. Yes?
This might be a dumb question. Can you bruise your diaphragm?
Can you bruise your diaphragm?
Feels
I don't see why not. It's just a muscle. It's kind of a deep muscle, but
Yeah, that is pretty bad.
questions on the respiratory pump?
How is this affecting your asthma?
Asthma is in the lungs, so asthma is going to affect your ability to get the oxygen from your lungs into your blood, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter.
Cool.
Okay, third venous return mechanism is going to be vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is the radius of the vessel getting narrower, right? So that's going to push the blood through more forcefully. If you think about spraying water out of a hose, and then you use your thumb to cover half of the opening, what does the water do? It shoots out more forcefully. So same thing if you narrow your vessels, it forces the blood through more forcefully. And so that's going to end up helping you get blood back up to the heart. Okay, is there anything else from chapter 7 that I missed? We'll figure it out. Okay. That's a great question. I keep forgetting to put dates on them. I will eventually. I'll give you a warning. Alright, chapter 8. Chapter 8, 4 parts of respiration. So I'm going to name and define them, and then this chapter is going to be going through them all in detail. So first part is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is moving air in and out of the lungs. Pulmonary ventilation is moving air in and out of your lungs. Second part of respiration is pulmonary diffusion. Pulmonary diffusion is the gas exchange at the lungs. Pulmonary diffusion is the gas exchange at the lungs. So that will be oxygen going from the lungs into the blood and carbon dioxide going from the blood into the lungs.
One more time.
Yeah. Pulmonary diffusion is the gas exchange at the lungs. It'll be oxygen going from the lungs into the blood and carbon dioxide going from the blood into the lungs. That'll make more sense when we get details. Third part of respiration is transportation. That is delivering the oxygen to the exercising muscle. Delivering the oxygen to the exercising muscle. And then the fourth part will be capillary diffusion. Capillary diffusion is the gas exchange at the muscle. Capillary diffusion is the gas exchange at the muscle. So oxygen going from the blood into the muscle, carbon dioxide going from the muscle into the blood.
Repeat that one more time.
Yes, capillary diffusion is the gas exchange at the muscle. Oxygen going from the blood into the muscle, carbon dioxide going from the muscle into the blood. So these first two pulmonary ventilation and pulmonary diffusion are considered external respiration. Capillary diffusion is considered internal respiration. And then transportation is the link between the two. So transportation is the link between external and internal respiration. So internal is the deep one, it's all the way down inside your muscle. External is the one that's kind of connected to the outside, bringing air in and out. All right, so we're gonna start with details of pulmonary ventilation. Bringing air in and out of the lungs. So we're gonna separate that into two parts. Inspiration is bringing air into the lungs. And expiration is bringing air out of the lungs. Inspiration, bringing air into the lungs. Expiration, bringing air out of the lungs. So we're gonna go through in detail the process of inspiration, how we get air into the lungs. Most people think that bringing air into the lungs causes the lungs to expand. That's not true. The lungs expanding causes air to come in. Okay, so when you are describing the process of inspiration, you should not start with air coming into the lungs. That's the end of the process. That's the last thing that happens, air coming into the lungs. You've got inspiration. So there's a process that leads up to that. Okay, so again, you have your torso. Cut in half by the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is your breathing muscle. When it's relaxed, it's curved upwards. When you want to take a breath in, you contract your diaphragm. When you contract your diaphragm, it flattens out. When it flattens out, that allows the lungs to expand. When the lungs expand, that's an increase in lung volume, because now they have more space inside them. So if there's an increase in volume, the air molecules inside the lungs are going to be able to spread out more. If the molecules can spread out more, that's a decrease in pressure. Okay, so there's an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. When volume goes up, pressure goes down. If you have more space, the molecules can spread out. That's a decrease in pressure. If you have less space, the molecules are pressed together. Okay, so if I were to take all 35 of you and try to smash you into a closet, that's a decrease in volume because you have less space, which would cause an increase in pressure because you guys would be crammed together shoulder to shoulder. Okay, if I let you out into the parking lot, that's an increase in volume, so you have lots of space, so you can spread out, so it's a decrease in pressure. Okay, so that increase in lung volume is going to cause a decrease in lung pressure. That is Boyle's law. Boyle's law said there's an inverse relationship between pressure and volume. Boyle's law says there's an inverse relationship between pressure and volume. That means when one goes up, the other goes down. That's my son playing his clarinet.
Really?
No way.
I thought that was Incredibles, like,
Yeah, I did too.
It's him playing The Incredibles.
Oh, look at
I wonder you guys in,
That was several years ago. Okay. Okay, so inverse relationship means one goes down and the other goes up. So, you want to take a breath in, you contract the diaphragm, it flattens out, that allows the lungs to expand. That's an increase in lung volume, which based on Boyle's law causes a decrease in lung pressure. that creates a pressure gradient. A gradient means there's a difference in pressure between one area and another. Just like when we talked about the neuron and how there was a potential, right? There was a difference in charge between the inside and outside. Here, same thing, but it's pressure. So there's a difference in pressure between the inside and outside. So we've got low pressure in the lungs because the lungs have just expanded, as compared to the outside air where there's high pressure. So there's a pressure gradient here. The air always wants to equalize the pressure. So it's always going to move down the pressure gradient from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure to equalize it. Okay, so this is going to cause the air to go into your lungs. Okay, that's the process of inspiration. I'll go over it again. When you want to bring air into your lungs, you start with a contraction of the diaphragm. The diaphragm will flatten out, which will allow the lungs to expand. That increase in lung volume, based on Boyle's law, will cause a decrease in lung pressure. That decrease in lung pressure will create a pressure gradient. So now the pressure is higher in the outside air than it is inside your lungs. So the air will move down the pressure gradient to equalize. Okay, so when you're describing the process of inspiration, you need to start with the contraction of the diaphragm. Don't start with air coming into the lungs. End with air coming into the lungs. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you want to expire, all you have to do is relax the diaphragm. When you relax the diaphragm, it's going to curve upward, which is going to compress the lungs. That's a decrease in volume. So what will happen to pressure? So now we've got high pressure inside the lungs as compared to low pressure in the outside. So the air will move out down the pressure gradient. Okay, so for expiration, you relax the diaphragm will curve upward, compress the lungs. Compressing the lungs is a decrease in volume, which based on Boyle's law causes an increase in pressure. So this creates another pressure gradient, but this time there's higher pressure inside the lungs than there is in the outside air. So the air moves down the pressure gradient, it moves out. Okay, keep in mind the pressure on the outside air is not changing. Pressure on the outside air is staying the same. The pressure in your lungs is going up and down based on the movement of the diaphragm. Okay, so as soon as there's a gradient, the air is going to move, depending on where the gradient is going. Does that make sense? Yes?
So the pressure is always going to go from high to low, right?
The air will always move from high pressure to low pressure, yes. Down the pressure gradient. So, inspiration is active. I just used that term a few minutes ago. What does it mean to be active? It requires muscle contraction. What muscle are we talking about here? Diaphragm. So inspiration is active. It requires contraction of the diaphragm. Expiration is passive. All you have to do is relax the diaphragm. But you can actively expire if you choose to. For example, if you want to blow out some birthday candles. All you have to do is bring in additional musculature to compress your thoracic cavity, compress your lungs, increase the pressure, and make more of a pressure gradient and drive the air out. So you can do that with your serratus anterior, you can do that with your transverse abdominis, anything that's going to help compress to blow air out. So inspiration is active, expiration is typically passive, but it can be made active if you choose to. Questions on that? Yes?
So like when you're lifting weights, is that why they say to breathe out?
So that is to avoid the Valsalva maneuver, which is holding your breath during exertion, which is dangerous. So the expiration during that is so that you don't hold your breath. Yeah. But that's bracing as well for stabilization. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. It's like 5:17.